All right, so now that we have an understanding as to what Wazuh is, its features, how we can deploy it, we can actually get started with the practical demonstration. So I'm going to be performing or accessing Wazuh. So we're going to set up the Wazuh server on Linode through my Kali Linux VM. As I said, you can do this from whatever operating system you want. One of the cool things is that we don't even need to SSH into the Wazuh server, because once we set the Linode up, then we pretty much have to give it a couple of minutes. Once it's set up, we can then get started. So let me just switch over to my Kali Linux VM. All right, so I'm back on my Kali Linux VM, and as you can see, I have set up an Ubuntu server that we're going to be installing the Wazuh agent on, but that's for later. And then we have the Wazuh production server, which I set up and configured already. I haven't changed the default settings. I've just set up the Windows agent. So I'm going to be using that particular Linode here. But, to get started, let me show you how to create your own Wazuh server, if you will. So I'm just going to click on create here and make sure you're logged into your dashboard. By the way, as I said, Linode has been kind enough to provide, our entire audience with $100 in free Linode credit. So you can actually follow along with this for free. Just click the link in the description and you should be able to redeem that credit. Once that is done, just head over and create a new Linode and click on Marketplace, and you can immediately launch the Wazuh app directly here. So there we are. We have Wazuh here. So you can click on that. If you have I do recommend entering an address for the Let's Encrypt SSL certificate. So if you are setting this up for production, then of course you're also going to be setting up a domain for the Wazuh server. But in our case, we really don't need to do that. So you can enter an email here, so test@test.com, because I'm not going to be using this server. You can then create a limited sudo user. And I do recommend doing this. So in my case, I can just say Alexis, specified the password for the limited sudo user. If you want to use an SSH public key for authentication or an SSH key pair, then you can say disable root access over SSH, or you can select the SSH public key directly from here. Disregard this if you're not using the actual, Linode's DNS service. And of course, if you are, then you can specify the subdomain for the DNS record and the actual domain here. Wazuh is set up on Ubuntu 20.04, which is fine. And then you can select the region closest to you for the purposes of speed and latency. I can select London, for example. Now, this is very, very important. This is where the resources come into play. So let me just head over to the Wazuh website, because I do want to explain a couple of things. So this is the Wazuh website. It's accessible on wazuh.com. And as you can see from the description, Wazuh is a free, open source and enterprise-ready security monitoring solution for threat detection, integrity monitoring, incident response, and compliance. So I do recommend taking a look at the documentation here. And more specifically, under the actual installation guide, you can click on requirements, and you can see, this is these are the supported Linux distributions. So you have an AMI image for Amazon, AWS. You have CentOS, Debian, Fedora, OpenSUSE, Oracle, Red Hat, and Ubuntu. Any version of Ubuntu newer than 14.04. All right. One thing, as I said, that you want to keep in mind is the resource consumption. So in a distributed deployment, both the Wazuh server and Elastic Stack are installed on separate hosts. This configuration is recommended for environments that require high availability and scalability of the services. The Wazuh server and Elastic Stack can both be installed as a single node or as a multi-node cluster. Kibana can either be installed on the same node, Elasticsearch on a dedicated host. So the hardware recommendations are provided here. So if you are setting this up for production based on 100 users, they do recommend 8 gigs of RAM and 4 CPU cores. However, as I said, in our case and in your case, if you're only testing a couple of agents, then you can use 2 gigs of RAM with 1 CPU or 2 gigs of RAM with 2 CPUs as specified here. So you also need to keep in mind that because we're not using a distributed deployment, we're using the standard all-in-one deployment here. you can see that there we are. The minimum requirements for this type of deployment are 4 gigs of RAM and 2 CPU cores. And of course, a 64-bit operating system is required. So a typical use case for this kind of environment supports around 100 agents. So based on based on that number, you can essentially identify or determine what you require in terms of what is required in terms of system resource consumption. So in this case, because I'm not going to be setting this up, you can use any of these. So this is the recommended one, the Linode 4 gigabyte. The actual 4 gigabyte option here, and that also has 80 gigs of storage and 4 terabyte transfer limit per month, and you also get the network connection here. So you can then provide it with a name, so I can say Wazuh test, and then specify the password for the root user, and that's pretty much it. I mean, if you want to get started, this is pretty much it, as opposed to actually manually installing Wazuh. So again, if you take a look at the installation instructions, if I go into the actual all-in-one deployment and the installation methods, we have an unattended installation, or the step-by-step installation. You can see that this is quite lengthy. So thanks to Linode, we don't need to go through any of that. We just need to set up the parameters here, and you can then click on create. As I said, we're not going to be using this one because I've already set up a Wazuh server. So there we are, and there we are. So it's actually provisioning, so that'll take a couple of seconds. As I said, I'm not using this, so I'll just delete that, and we'll take a look at the Wazuh production one that I set up here. So in order to access Wazuh, you just need to copy the IP, unless you have actually configured DNS and you have a domain name. You can then access it via that domain name or the subdomain that you've set. If you've not set a domain and you're using this for testing, just copy the IP, open up a new tab, make sure you open up the IP in your browser with HTTPS as opposed to HTTP. The first time you do that, you'll be asked to essentially accept or confirm that the SSL certificate is not valid. As I said, in production, you want to make sure that you have a valid SSL certificate. But after a couple of minutes, because Wazuh will actually take a couple of minutes to set up, because if you try and access it immediately after you set up the Linode, you're going to see an error here. So give it probably around 5 minutes to set up. So you can go get yourself a cup of coffee, and when you're back, you can then open up the IP. And of course, you now have the actual Elastic Stack here. So this is perfectly normal. Wazuh is set up on top of the Elastic Stack, as I said. So the default credentials are admin and admin, which I did not change, just to show you that this is the case. So in your case, just type in admin, admin, and we'll give this a couple of seconds to load up. After which, you will be taken directly to the Kibana dashboard here, and it should actually open up Wazuh. There we are, fantastic. So it's going to run a couple of checks. It's going to check the API, and it's going to run a couple of other checks. Once those checks are passed, it's then going to take a couple of seconds to load up, and you should have access to Wazuh right over here. So this is the screen you'll be greeted with. In my case, you can see I've already added the Windows 7 agent. So again, just disregard that. You should have 0 agents and 0 active agents. Right, so welcome to Wazuh. So let's get started with the first step, and that of course is to change your default password. So by default, you're the admin user, so you can go ahead and reset your password because that is recommended. You never want an attacker to essentially gain access to Wazuh because then they pretty much can do whatever they want, or understand or get an idea as to what agents you have or what systems are part of the organization. So the current password is admin, and I can set up a new password here. Let me just type that in correctly. So there we go. And I can then hit reset. So that's very important. Resource admin is read only. Let's see. Why is that failed to reset password? Forbidden message resource admin is read only. Oh yes, I think I know what's causing that issue. That's because you actually need to log into the Wazuh server that you've just set up, and you need to modify the filebeat configuration file, which is in YAML. That will allow you to change your credentials. So we can just hit cancel here. So in order to do that, log into your Wazuh server that you set up on Linode via SSH. You can also do it via their really cool I'll just open it up here. They also have a really cool Lish console, which will just open it up for you here. So in a new window, you can access SSH within your browser. So that'll probably prompt me to log in. Indeed, it's already logged me in. So let me just click on that here. And for some reason that is not expanding. I do not want to do that. Let me just open it up again. And there we are. So in order to essentially change the admin password, just open up the file etc filebeat and filebeat.yaml. So YML, hit enter, and as you can see, you can change your username and password here. All right, and you can also customize a few other options, but again, in this case, this is really not required. So I'm just going to go ahead and change this, or you can, you know what, I'm just going to leave it as default, because in my case, I'm not really using this for production, but in your case, that's how to change it. Once that is done, just try logging out and logging back in. All right, so we'll have a notification here. This is pertinent to Elastic. So if you right click on this little sidebar here, you can see that you have the Wazuh plugin or Wazuh running on top of Elastic, which makes sense. And then of course you have Kibana here. And at the bottom, you have the open distro for Elasticsearch, where, you know, you can take a look at the query workbench, reporting, notebooks, alerting, anomaly detection, trace analytics, index management, security, etc. And then, of course, you have stack management, which if I click on it here, you can take a look at the index patterns. In this case, the index patterns are already configured for Wazuh, where you have Wazuh alerts. You also have Wazuh monitoring and Wazuh statistics. You can create your own your own index pattern if you want, based on the actual index available. So you can see that I can create or define the actual index name, and I can specify, for example, Wazuh alerts 4.0 or 4.x. So let's go back into Wazuh. So I'll just click on it here. And there's a few things that I need to explain firstly, right? So again, just give it a couple of seconds. Once that is loaded, what we want to do is let's click on this drop down here. So by default, it'll take you to the modules page. So these are all the available modules or features, if you will. So you have under security information management, you have security events, which is very important. That's what we're going to be focusing on. So this allows you to browse through your security alerts, identify issues and threats in your environment. You then have integrity monitoring. This essentially shows you alerts related to file changes, including permissions, content ownership, and attributes. Very, very important. You then have threat detection and response, which is what we're also going to be taking a look at. So we have vulnerability detection. So discover what applications in your environment are affected by well-known vulnerabilities. And then you have the MITRE ATT&CK framework here, or the MITRE ATT&CK tactics, techniques, and procedures. So this will display security events from the knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques used on real-world observations. So what that means is, in the case of the MITRE ATT&CK module, is that it, for example, if someone compromises a system within my network and they use a particular technique, like they try and change or add a new user, then this module will essentially identify that particular event and it will essentially link it to a MITRE tactic, technique or procedure, and will give you that ID. So you can essentially start, performing threat modeling and, get a better threat intelligence in regards to what you're dealing with, which is also very, very useful. You then have auditing and policy monitoring, where you have policy monitoring, where you can verify that your systems are configured according to your security policies baseline. This is very important. So if you work in an organization, then you know that a company has, or an organization usually has, a security policy that applies to pretty much, employees, systems, email security, password security, etc. And based on the actual company or organization's security policy for systems, you can essentially get a hold of that, and you can then see how it's doing, against that security policy, or actually verify that all the systems that you've added or that you're monitoring are in line or in accordance with that security policy. You can also perform a security configuration assessment. This is very interesting or very useful because it allows you to scan your assets as part of a configuration assessment audit. You can also perform system auditing, again, extremely useful. So this audit uses behavior, monitoring, command execution, and alerting on access to critical files. The area that we'll not be taking a look at, because again, we're really not interested in that at this point, is regulatory compliance, where you can essentially test systems, based on the following regulations or compliance standards. So we have PCI DSS, which is used for, this is usually very helpful for organizations that, that essentially store or transmit payment or cardholder data. And of course, you have HIPAA, which is, for companies that are essentially in the health industry, GDPR, NIST 853. So really, really powerful. Okay, so those are the modules. If you click on this drop down here, you can see that it'll provide you with the modules directory, which we've already accessed here. You then have management. This is very important. This is where you have the administration section and the status and reports. So this is where you have your rules, decoders, CDP lists, groups, and configuration. So under rules, this is where it'll essentially tell you can manage your rules. So by default, you'll get 3,148 rules. You can manage the rule files. So, there we are. You can actually view each of these rule files. They're in XML. So this is just a generic template here. But if we take a look at a couple of interesting ones like Cisco iOS rules, for example, you can see that there are rules set up for specific types of intrusions or security events. So this is again very, very similar to what Snort does in regards to intrusion detection. The only thing is that Wazuh visualizes or displays this in a much better way. Right, and so that's rules. You can also import files and export the formatted files, and you can also take a look at custom rules. Right, so this is the local rules.xml file. As I said, very, very similar to how Snort works. So let's go back to management. We've taken a look at rules. We then have decoders, which I'll not be exploring, but this is essentially responsible for decoding the information that's being sent into Wazuh for processing and analysis. You then have groups where you can essentially create agent groups. So based on your organization, I can create a group and say, for example, Linux servers. I'll just call it servers here. So these are organizational units where you can essentially, assign agents to them based on their role or functionality within an organization. So you can see this is the default one here. This is where I've already added the Windows 7 system. So I've already configured the agent on it. So if I go into files, you can see this is essentially, the list of, you can list and see your group files, and you can also edit the group configuration. So again, that's something that's really not important at this point. So if we go back to management, we then have the configuration. So this is very important. So this is essentially where you can customize Wazuh and get it to work the way you want it to work. So this configuration file is literally the home of everything. Like with any tool that runs on Linux, the conf file is very important. So you have your main configurations whereby you have the global configuration, the cluster registration service. So this is for the automatic agent registration. You then have alerts and integrations. So if you want to see the current alert configuration, it's going to open up the OSS. Let me give that a couple of seconds. This is still for alerts. So you can essentially specify the general alert settings, whereby you can set the minimum severity level to store the alert, the minimum severity level to send the alert by email. So you can modify that based on your requirements. Now you might be saying to yourself, I can't really modify this. However, if you click on JSON here, then you can modify it in JSON format, and you can also do it in XML format. I'll get into this in a second. And then of course you can configure email alerts, which I'll also get to, where you can configure the SMTP server and the email that you'd like to use, in order for Wazuh to send you email notifications or email alerts, which is very important for any security engineer. You then have reports, right? And in this case, the configuration is not available because, you need to customize that yourself. So the configuration is sorted into all of these segments. So for example, under system threats and incident response, you can see that in my case, I've enabled vulnerability detection, and by default, it's not going to be enabled in your case. And then you can specify the interval between the scan executions. If you click on it, you can see that you cannot actually modify it. So you have to do it either through JSON or XML. And if we actually go back to that, I didn't cover one important aspect there, and that of course is providers, where you can see in this case we're using the NVD database. So that's just a very basic vulnerability, that's a very basic signature database that's typically used by vulnerability scanning tools like OpenVAS or Nessus. So in order to configure these options, I typically like modifying the entire configuration. So this will open it up here in XML format. So firstly, you have your OSS EC or OSSEC configuration, where you can firstly configure, the JSON output format. You can set that to yes. This will make sense in a couple of seconds. I recommend leaving that as yes. We want to log alerts. Do we want to log all? No. Log all JSON? No. Email notification, we can set that to yes. You can then configure your SMTP server, who is the email from, and the email to, and then of course email, the actual amount of emails to send per hour. And there we are, the agent's disconnection time, so 10 minutes. And of course you then have the agent's disconnection alert time, which is 0. Right, under alerts, you can see that's the option that we were able to configure a couple of seconds ago or a couple of minutes ago in the actual configuration, in the actual configuration page. And then of course, right over here, you have logging, right? So you can choose between plain JSON or plain JSON for the format of internal logs. This is very important. So currently it's set to plain. I recommend leaving that as is. And then, of course, you have policy monitoring. So this is it disabled? No. So that means it's enabled. So it'll check files, check Trojans, yes. Check dev, check sys, check process IDs, yes. And check ports, yes. So leave all of this, turn all of this to yes, and make sure that this is set to no. That is essentially the disabled flag. So if you set this to yes, then it'll disable policy monitoring. All right, you then have the next important one is going to be the OS query integration. So you have the ability to enable OS query because OS query is quite important. So let me just open up a new tab and I'll open up OS query here in a couple of seconds. Right, so OS query, I'll just wait for this to load up and this will really explain it. So performant endpoint visibility. So OS query essentially uses basic SQL commands to leverage a relational data model to describe a device. So it essentially allows you to, learn more about your device. And in the case of Wazuh, it allows Wazuh to make queries, to learn more about the actual system where the agent is installed. So if I go back in here, the next option I'm going to set that we need to set is the system inventory. So this is currently enabled and the actual name is syscollector. So this will essentially get all information regarding the system. So you can see that it'll get the hardware information, the operating system information, network, packages, ports, processes, etc. Ports is currently set to no. So ports all no and yes. Okay, so that's fine. You then have the database synchronization settings. I would recommend leaving that as is. All right, you then have the vulnerability detector. So by default, it's going to be set to no. So make sure you set this to yes for enabled. So now the flag is enabled. So make sure enabled is set to yes. The interval is 5 minutes. That's perfectly fine. Run on startup, yes. And then you can specify whether you want to check for Ubuntu OS vulnerabilities, Debian, Red Hat, and in the case of Windows, I've enabled it. So because I am going to be installing an agent on Ubuntu, I'm going to say enable yes for Ubuntu, and we'll also enable this for Debian. So I'm just going to say enabled yes. And this is for Ubuntu. It's going to support all versions of Ubuntu from 16.04 all the way to the latest version. So yeah, that's important. The next is to aggregate vulnerabilities. Make sure that's set to yes, and you can then specify the actual age of the vulnerability database that you're using. In this case, the provider name is NVD. So you can also get other providers. So, you know, if I search for example, if I just open up a Google search and I say Wazuh vulnerability providers and give this a couple of seconds, you should be able to import your own. So let me just see if I can find one that works here. So yeah, within the docs, that's why I say always refer back to the docs. So this essentially explains how vulnerability detection works. So in the case of Ubuntu, it uses canonical.com to pull CVEs from for Ubuntu Linux distribution. So you can also add that as well. So if we go back into the actual Wazuh configuration here, you can essentially enable that if you want. And then of course, that's the end of the vulnerability detector section. You then have file integrity monitoring. You can set that, you can enable it. It's enabled by default, so this should be set to no. And then of course, scan on start, that is yes. And the other option that we would need to configure would be the actual active response, which is by default enabled, which is perfectly okay. And yeah, that's really what you need to do to get started. All right, so once that is done, you can just hit save. And then I would recommend restarting the manager. So this will take Wazuh offline for a couple of seconds. And there we are. So changes will not take effect until a restart is performed. So you can see it's going to fail all of these checks, and this is because it's restarting. So I'm just going to reload my page again, and it should run the checks, the health check again. And that should tell us that everything is okay. If it isn't, then again, just give it a couple of seconds. So I'll just refresh that again. In this case, the API is still down. So again, just give it a couple of seconds to a couple of minutes. If you want to view the error, you can do so. You can see the current API, the Wazuh API is down. I can retry that again to see if it's back up. There we are. So everything's back up now. I just want to take a couple of moments to thank our Patreons. Thank you, Michael Hubbard, Dustin Umpress, Jerry Speds, Doozy, Sid Saab, Ryan Carr, Shamir Douglas, Jojo Bibi, Palangos, Kush Kev, RS, Nino Buikov, and David Bricker. You guys are really awesome. Thank you very much for supporting us, and you guys make these types of videos possible. So we really appreciate it, and we look forward to producing even more high quality content.